Welcome to the Lorecast, a podcast in which we look deeply into the stories by which we live. As some listeners know, I've taught for years in circles that include consciousness studies, alternative spiritualities, esoteric studies, mythology, depth psychology, and related fields. And so as a result, I often see things pop up in different feeds on different platforms that have to do with what my colleagues and my students and I are up to in those areas. And so not long ago, I saw one posting that made a statement that I've often seen, and it was something to do with quantum physics has proved that consciousness changes the universe. And so I wanted to unpack not just that specific issue, but the way oftentimes we reach for scientific language in order to describe experiences that have been demonized by the dominant culture, both on the scientific side and on the religious side. And what we might do with some of the language we use. So, as somebody who studies quantum physics non-mathematically, I'm not an expert, but I try to keep up. The idea that quantum physics says anything like, consciousness changes reality or whatever, is actually not the way quantum physicists understand it these days. There were some early claims when all this was new in the early 1900s that, oh wow, whether we look at something determines whether, say, a photon shows up as a particle or a wave. But it actually does that even when it's being measured by an instrument and there's no consciousness in the room at all. And nobody really knows why. It does show how incredibly interactive everything is and how our investigations are deeply implicated in what we're looking at. I think that's a fair statement, and I think most physicists would agree with that much. But what some people have done with that is to say things like, this was from a post I saw last week. Somebody was saying, it's all vibration, we're vibrational beings, there are 5 kinds of vibration. I have no idea what they meant by that. And all this is backed up by quantum physics. No, it's not. None of that statement is backed up by quantum physics. So, there's been a tendency to do this for a long time. It may have started with theosophy back in the 1800s, and there are certain terms that are catchy and numinous for people that they batten onto. So back then it was magnetism, right? I'm manipulating the magnetic forces of such and such with my mind, And then as the science advanced a little bit, the language advanced too. But it's always decades behind where we are right now, which is an interesting lapse. And sometimes, of course, it's just slick salesmanship, like just sticking the word quantum on the beginning of something because you want to market your new way of doing yoga or your new book tour or whatever it is. So there isn't always an honest motive behind it, but usually there is. And in some cases, I think it's because we don't have good language for describing these ostracized experiences that so many of us have. How do we talk about them? So we tend to borrow metaphors and images from science to make them sound more respectable. But if you follow the science, it just sounds like nonsense. A term I hear a lot along similar lines is we want to raise the vibration of ourselves, our group, our clients, or whatever it is. I have never been able to determine exactly what that means. I think it means be more conscious. But the language is in the way of me understanding what's being said because it's so abstract and vague. Sometimes when I describe my work in terrapsychology, which traces how the contours of the land and features of specific places live in the human psyche as moods or inspirations or dream figures or what have you. I get asked questions like, have you studied the vortexes in Sedona? And I have not. I don't understand why it's vortex instead of vortices, but aside from that, when I've asked for an explanation, what is this vortex stuff that you're talking about? Well, they're energy fields. So what I do is end up leaping from one abstract term to another. The philosopher Christian de Quincey calls this energy talk. And energies, vibes, frequencies, all borrowed from science. And it's really trying to describe something that actually exists. But the problem, of course, is that the language is so vague, it's hard to say what it is. And this is a problem we have to get around. If you hear me present about parapsychology or you read my books, what you'll see is that when I'm talking about specific events, like there's ecological damage in a particular locale and it shows up as a depression. And so I don't talk about vibrations or frequencies. I talk about presence of place, presences, influences, moods that are induced in us somehow, which isn't much better. Induction's also an electrical term. And I think this issue with language is at least part of the problem why astrologers get such a bad rap. They're trying to describe relationships that are not causal, but they use causally laden language. They talk, for instance, about the influence of planetary transits. And so people in science or who love science, who've never studied a word of astrology, promptly jump on that and say, oh, it's pseudoscience and these people don't know what they're talking about. Mars doesn't make people angry and so on. But what's being discussed is a subtler, more synchronistic relationship, something more symbolic and metaphoric. Another aspect to this problem is that we all fall into the habit of literal mindedness. And so sometimes when describing certain experiences, certain subtle presences that we feel, we slip into literalizing and we say, you're sending me vibrations or I'm emitting frequencies. And there's nothing there, literally. So we forget that sometimes our best language for this is more symbolic or metaphoric. That might be a better way to describe these relationships that's closer to the experience. I was talking to somebody recently about a Neptune transit that I found out about in my chart during a time when I was going through a reflective period, particularly relevant to the area of the chart where the Neptune transit was occurring. And I remember describing it as the fact that there was such a transit was a deeply meaningful, symbolic relationship to me. And when I talk like that, it gets me out of the position of having to maintain that there's some kind of causal influence or that I'm being scientific or metaphysical or whatever, which I'm not. I'm saying that the relationship is meaningful to me, which is a different thing. For a young platform, I teach a class on Carl Jung's Black Books, his journals, and there are parts in there where the imaginal characters he talks to, one in particular who I think is Sophia, he's talking to her a lot in an act of imagination, and she keeps telling him, give up the science. Jung was at great pains, like a lot of us are, to maintain that the work that he was doing and the experiences that he was having were some kind of scientific research. And they may well have been if our definition of science were expanded, but right now it's not. And so to continue to maintain, I'm an empiricist, I'm a strict empiricist and all that, isn't terribly convincing to us who live nowadays after Jung. And I think Sophia knew that, which is why she kept urging him more to be on the side of the humanities. And of course, one nice thing about the humanities is that they give us more specific language for our experiences. So instead of, When somebody asks me what kind of a day I'm having, instead of saying my vibration or my frequency is really high today, I can say I feel really alive today. I feel a lot of enthusiasm for everything. I'm really in my senses, and the world looks very bright to me, and my mood's up there, and this is how it feels in my body, and so on. Which I think gives a more specific example of a state of mind and body than talking about frequencies. The same with synchronistic experiences, those marvelous, meaningful coincidences that seem to have meaning below anything causal. And, those of us who know that word synchronicity, which Jung gave us, can use it all the time because we notice it happening in our lives and it makes our lives richer. But a lot of people don't know what that word means. And it is kind of a clunky word. Jung teamed up with Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, to make synchronicity into a kind of natural law undiscovered by physics. He kind of put it across that way. And so it remains abstract and multisyllabic. But earlier today, I was thinking about a friend I haven't had contact with in a while and feeling a lot of love and that sense of missing someone and all that. And I thought I should tell her. So I was getting ready to reach out to her and I saw an email from her. And at the end of it, she said, "I love you." So that was a nice synchronicity, or whatever we want to call it. Being tuned in, which of course itself is kind of a mechanical term. And it's not that we shouldn't use these terms. It's that when we use them too much, everything goes abstract. And we also ignore the invitation to create a new vocabulary around our experiences. I think that might be one of the tasks that face us right now. And there's a lot of that about. There's in a more ecological direction. There are words being invented like solastalgia, but I think we can be a little bit closer to experience than words like that. It could be that we're getting a useful hint from French philosophers, especially the post-structuralists, when they take some ordinary word and they turn it into basically a theory. And they go on and on about it, and the abject comes to mind, or in psychology, some theorists do that. So Freud wrote about the uncanny, and he came up with all this stuff around it. But the usefulness in that is it takes ordinary terms that we all understand and it deepens them. So maybe we could do that. So off the top of my head, I'm going to play around a little bit with the word synchronicity. And some people might prefer to keep that word. A lot of the Jungians will. That's fine, as long as we know what we're talking about. But, synchronicity, as Jung himself pointed out, is based on an ancient idea that comes up pretty much in all cultures at some point. And it's been called correspondences. Stoic philosophers called it sympatheia, which is a really nice word. And sympathy, of course, is a common English word that means something similar to empathy, but I always think of sympathy as an empathy that's expressed, that lets people know that we're with them emotionally. And so I think I might try this as an experiment. I think I might take that good old word sympatheia and start using that instead of synchronicity, and of course explain what I'm doing and just see if it catches on. Maybe it won't. Certainly it'll sound a little funny the first time I tell somebody that my friend and I this morning were in sympatheia. Maybe that's not an improvement on synchronicity, I don't know. But to me it has a more emotional feel. It's not so heady and abstract. There was a good old Egyptian word from way back. Ancient Egyptians talked about Heka, which we would spell Heka, and even a goddess called Heka. And it was all about universal sympathies, universal resonances, synchronicities, that kind of thing. Worked its way into alchemy as the idea as above, so below. So there's a lot of agreement around and back through time that there are these, I don't know if they're special relationships, but these unusually deep resonances of some kind. So we could play around with that one and see what comes of it. Another term comes to mind that we use in parapsychology. We talk about the place field, as in the presence of a place. Maybe we should just talk about presence or sympatheia or what have you. And it refers to how you go to a certain place and its qualities soak into you somehow, and you end up emotionally responding to whatever it is that you're confronting in that particular place. So, one obvious example would be going up on a mountaintop to do some deep thinking and then having a revelation at the top. So, place field is itself sort of an abstract term. Maybe we can do better. Another word I hear sometimes that may or may not be a little bit of a problem is telepathy and telepathic, mostly because it's not a bad word and it's worked its way into common usage. But what people often visualize is some beam of energy going from one skull to another. And I kind of like Jung's argument that it's not really an energy transmission, but it is some kind of shared thought or experience. So, we do have a useful word that Star Trek gave us when talking about Vulcan mind melds, so maybe melding. What if we use that word instead? And then there are the words that we've worn out more or less because we've kind of dumbed them down. So people often, when they realize something, say, I had an epiphany. It was such a good old word. It used to mean the appearance of a divine being right in front of you, like an angel shows up or something. Or you have a visionary experience of some kind and you're completely overwhelmed with it. So it was a very strong word. And of course, it worked itself into Christian language as well. Christ would show up for people and they would go, oh my God. And, now it just means having an insight. Maybe we could just say that. Like give the word a rest for a while, right? It's worked hard for us. A more mundane word, incredible, which has been, of course, also been massively overused. It used to mean something so amazing and stupefying that it couldn't even happen. It wasn't even possible. And now it just means wow, an incredible bargain, right? And for the sake of Hermes, could we please stop putting the word quantum onto things that have nothing to do with it? Quantum consciousness, quantum yoga. It's just sales slogans. And I invoke Hermes because I think he's in charge of the quantum world. Just think about how it works. I think there's another benefit, too, to understanding and working with the language we use. Some of it is pretty distancing and lends itself to projection. So when we say that somebody has a bad vibe, we're basically making it their fault, right? But if you were to say, I feel uncomfortable around that person and I don't know why, then you're kind of owning it more. And then it's not necessarily their fault, it's something registering in you. And I think there's an invitation for some self inquiry too. If we find ourselves often saying that person's energy is bad, their vibe is bad, or whatever, that sounds like blaming dressed up in spiritual language. So we might want to look at that. Sometimes, too, in our language, a little bit of ego swings in when we don't intend it. So when we go around exclaiming, I manifested that, notice how different that is from describing it more in terms of, I got into alignment or I adapted to circumstances and I brought my full intentionality into it. And, that's a sort of clumsy way of expressing it, but language that would allow us to acknowledge that sometimes when we quote manifest something, we're actually sensing possibilities that we then get ourselves aligned with somehow. Or again, a technical term, right? Get in sync with. Hard to avoid them. But this isn't This isn't a suggestion that we go hunting for imperfections in how people speak or anything judgmental like that. It's more an opening into the question of how can I be more specific when I describe subtle layers of experience? So consider it an invitation. Thanks.